Welcome to the channel, my friends. Today we're going to be looking at this Chinese ATV. We'll talk about why you would want one or why you wouldn't want one. Now this one happens to be a 125cc. They do make them in 90cc, I believe, and 110cc, and even 150, I believe, is the biggest one. Again, not your best quality product here, but for the price, I think it works pretty good for a beginner. This is something that's actually made for the youth. It's kind of like a kid's ATV. They are built kind of cheaply, being it is a Chinese made. But for a beginner, they're actually not too bad. There's some good features on these. So it does have drum brakes on the front. Rear has a disc, which is excellent. That works very good, actually. Now this is a 2021 model, so it's fairly new. It has a carrier here in the back. There was one here in the front, which I removed. It was just kind of ugly and unusable, so I took that off the front, but they do come with them. Again, there's quite a few issues with these, but like I said, for a beginner and for what you pay for them, you can improve them quite a bit and make them useful. Now here's some of the things I've done to it, which you kind of have to if you're going to have one of these. One of the very first thing I did to this was change the gear ratios. Now, to begin with, from factory, these things are geared kind of high. They're really just made for pavement. You could drive it around in the driveway or the sidewalks or the paved streets. But when you get into some mud or anything like that, they just don't have the torque to even make it up the smallest hill. It probably won't even go up a piece of 2x4 from a standstill. So one of the first improvements, which is a must, is the gearing. I ended up putting a smaller gear on the front crank right here. Originally had a 13 tooth, and I went to a 10 tooth. Of course, I had to shorten one link from the chain, and that made a huge difference in the torque. Now we're able to do a little bit of a trail action with this. Now what I should have done was change the back gear and gone bigger on that at the same time, but I didn't do that. That's something I will be doing later. So again, I did put a smaller gear in the front here, one from 13 to a 10 tooth, and that made it rideable to where it can actually carry a full-size adult just about and be able to move from a standstill. So that's one of the first things I did. And after that, another thing I did do was replace the carburetor. I went to a bigger carburetor on this with an open cone style filter. So originally these have a I believe a 20 millimeter, and I went to a 22. So a little bit of a bigger carb on this. They do sell aftermarket bigger intake elbows also, but the problem with this is the ones that you find online aftermarket, they angle this way, and this has electric starter here, and then there's no room for the carburetor. I still haven't found one that'll work with this, but just going to a bigger carburetor made it idle much smoother. It fires right up, breathes better, runs better. Another thing I did do was put some wheel spacers on this in the back. You can see how that sits now. I didn't do that on the front. I'd like to eventually, but just doing the back kind of gives it much more stability, I believe. And I ended up just using these spacers. These are 2-inch to give it a little better stance. And it's a little bit more stable, so it's less likely to tip from side to side. I do like to eventually do that on the front. I just didn't do that because originally from factory, the front is wider than the rear. Now it's kind of even, so I kind of left it at that. Now they do sell different styles of the spacers on these. There are hub style spacers also that you can get instead of these studs. Those hub ones are much safer. They're a little bit more expensive and kind of hard to find in the size that you need for these. So that's the reason I did not. But eventually, when I do the fronts, I'd like to go with those. Overall, for a beginner, if you make these improvements, it's not a bad ATV. They come in many different colors. Now, another cool feature on this, it comes with this engine kill remote. So if you have a kid that's kind of getting away from you, you can always hit the engine kill button and it actually kills the engine in case of an emergency or what have you. Again, this was the original carburetor on this. I changed it to a bigger carb. I changed the front gear on the sprocket, or the front sprocket, to a smaller one. Eventually I'll do a bigger sprocket in the rear. That'll give us a little bit more torque. That's what's needed. Again, these things from factory have pretty high end. I'm sure it'll probably do 30 plus miles per hour the way they come, but there's just no torque to do any kind of trail riding or anything with these. Another thing that's kind of needs to be improved on these is the suspension. Suspension is way too stiff on these. There's really no flex, even with a 160, 70, 80 pound adult on it. The suspension seems to be super stiff. So that's another improvement I will be making. We'll look at some aftermarket springs and shocks for this and see if we can improve the suspension. So now here's a little clip of this thing in action. Way better. You can still see it struggling at small hills. And I will put some of the parts that I use to improve this in the description for you. The price that you pay for these things, I think for a beginner, it's not bad. It's somewhere to start. Obviously, it's definitely not for an experienced rider. You're not going to be able to do some heavy trail riding or off-roading with any of these. But you can improve them to get them to have some fun with these. So for the price, I say if somebody's looking to get into ATVs or it's their first ATV, not bad. Once you make these improvements, it's definitely doable. You can find pretty much any parts for these to improve the ride quality and improve the gearing and such, and give it some more power. So it's much more fun to ride it that way as you grow, or as the kid grows into this. So we'll be making some more improvements to this, including the suspension and some other parts. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching.